The day the world of medieval kinship studies was shaken to its core. It all started with a simple question. A question that, when Goetz posed it, opened a Pandora's box of ancient mysteries and modern misunderstandings. What did kinship really mean in the early Middle Ages? And what roles did it play in people's lives? This wasn't just an academic curiosity. It was a question that could rewrite the history books. Goetz wasn't the first to ask, but he was one of the few who dared to challenge the long-held assumptions. For centuries, historians had believed that kinship was a fixed, unchanging system, a web of blood ties and marriages that shaped society. They saw it as a fundamental building block of medieval life, a structure that was as natural and inevitable as the seasons. But Goetz saw something different. He saw a complex, ever-changing network of relationships that could form and dissolve almost as quickly as alliances on a battlefield. Imagine a world where the word family didn't just mean the people you were born to, but could also include friends, neighbors, and even strangers who were bound together by shared interests or mutual needs. This was the world Goetz was exploring, a world where kinship was more than just biology. It was a social contract, a way of life. But here's the kicker. The people in the Middle Ages didn't think about kinship the way we do. They didn't have a word for it, not in the abstract sense. Instead, they talked about people, about relatives, about connections that were as much about choice as they were about blood. This realization was both simple and profound. It meant that the historian's job wasn't just to trace family trees, but to understand the web of relationships that made medieval society tick. Goetz's work was a wake-up call. He collected stories and examples that showed how kinship worked in the Middle Ages, but he also asked tough questions. How far did kinship extend beyond the immediate family? Was it a unified system, or were there cracks and tensions that threatened to break it apart? These were not just theoretical questions. They were questions that could explain why some families rose to power while others fell into obscurity. As Goetz delved deeper, he found that kinship wasn't just a background element in medieval society. It was a central force, but it wasn't the only force. Monasteries, manors, and feudal relationships were all part of the mix. Over time, these other social formations didn't replace kinship. They integrated it, sometimes in surprising ways. Kinship didn't weaken. It adapted, evolving alongside the changing world. But Goetz's work also revealed a deeper issue. For all the talk of kinship, many historians were still trapped in a way of thinking that assumed kinship was primarily about blood ties. They talked about real kinship and fictive kinship, as if there was a clear line between the two. But what if that line was a modern invention, a way of making the past fit our own ideas of family and social order? This is where the story gets even more interesting. Scholars like Gero Jalabert, Lejan, and Morsel warned that kinship wasn't always tied to biology. They pointed to practices like adoption, where social recognition of family ties could override biological connections. But when it came to actual research, they often fell back on the old ways. They traced genealogical lines, looking for biological connections, even when they knew that kinship was more than just blood. Even when historians tried to break away from this biogenetic trap, they found it hard to escape. Jessen, for example, recognized the problems with assuming kinship was rooted in biology, but he still felt the need to examine the relationship between kinship and biological reproduction. Because the idea of kinship as a biological fact was so deeply ingrained that it was hard to imagine it any other way. This is the challenge that Goetz's work, and the work of a new generation of historians, has taken on. They are asking us to see kinship in a new light, to understand it as a dynamic, multifaceted concept that can't be reduced to biology. They are asking us to see the Middle Ages as a world where kinship was a living, breathing part of society, a system that could change and adapt to the needs of the people who lived in it. And in the end, this new understanding of kinship isn't just about the past. It's about how we see ourselves and our relationships today. Because if kinship wasn't just about blood in the Middle Ages, maybe it's not just about blood now either. Maybe it's about the choices we make, the people we choose to stand by, and the bonds we form that make us who we are. Lubich's study on kinship in medieval Europe is a fascinating but complex journey. He aimed to explore how people related to each other in the past, but his approach had some significant limitations. To understand these, let's break down his work and see what he did and what he missed. Lubich started by looking at the Vulgate, the Latin version of the Bible. because it was a central text in medieval Europe. However, he was concerned that the Bible might reflect ideas from other cultures, like Hebrew, Greek, or Roman, rather than medieval European ideas. To avoid this, he decided not to consider how medieval authors used biblical references when talking about family and relationships. This decision meant that he missed out on a lot of rich material that could have given deeper insights into how people thought about kinship. When Lubich did look at the Vulgate, he focused on Old Testament passages, which often emphasize blood relationships. For example, he noted that terms like consanguinitas, blood relation, and propinquitas, closeness, were used to describe family ties. But he ignored the New Testament, where Jesus talks about a broader, more spiritual understanding of family. This narrow focus limited his understanding of how kinship was viewed in medieval times. Lubich also examined texts like Isidore's etymologies, which are like medieval dictionaries. He thought these would give him clear definitions of kinship terms, but he found that they were not as consistent as he hoped. Even in religious texts, which he expected to be very precise, the terms for family relationships were often vague. This inconsistency made it hard for Lubich to draw firm conclusions. Lubich's real interest was in royal diplomas and historical narratives, which he thought would show how powerful families were connected. He spent a lot of time on these sources, but his understanding of them was quite traditional. He focused on chronicles and histories, which often emphasized blood ties and genealogies, while giving less attention to other types of sources, like hagiographies' saints' lives, which might have offered different perspectives. One of the most interesting findings in Lubich's study was how kings and nobles sometimes described people as close relatives, even when they weren't actually blood related. For example, a king might call someone a consanguine blood relative to show that they were important and trusted. Lubich called these honorary or false blood relationships, but this terminology might be too simplistic. It's possible that these relationships were meaningful in their own right, even if they weren't based on actual blood ties. Throughout his work, Lubich struggled with the idea that kinship could be more flexible and diverse than he initially assumed. He expected kinship terms to be stable and clear, but they often weren't. This led him to conclude that the terms were inconsistent, which might not be the best way to understand how people use them in everyday life. In the end, Lubich's study highlights the challenges of studying kinship in the past. While he made important contributions, his approach was limited by his focus on biological relationships and his expectation of consistency in terminology. By exploring a wider range of sources and considering more varied forms of kinship, historians might gain a richer and more nuanced understanding of how people related to each other in medieval Europe. When we look back at history, we often find that the way we understand the past is influenced by the time in which we live. Historians are just like anyone else. They can't help but see the past through the lens of their own experiences and beliefs. This means that what we write about history will always be a mix of what actually happened and how we, in the present, make sense of it. In the 19th century, historians like Leopold von Ranke and Karl Lamprecht had different ideas about how to study history. Ranke believed that historians should try to understand the past as it really was. Why is eigentlich gewesen? He thought it was important to get inside the minds of people from the past and see the world as they saw it. On the other hand, Lamprecht wanted to explain how it actually came to be. Why ist eigentlich geworden? He was more interested in understanding the causes and processes that led to historical events. These two approaches might seem different, but they are not completely separate. Historians often need to do both understand the past on its own terms and explain how it led to the present. For example, when we study kinship, or how families and relationships worked in the past, we try to see how people thought about family and why they organized their lives the way they did. But we also want to know how those ideas and practices shaped the world we live in today. One of the biggest challenges in studying the past is avoiding the trap of thinking that the way things are now is the way they've always been. In the 19th century, many historians believed that human societies had evolved from primitive to civilized, and they saw their own time as the peak of that evolution. This idea influenced how they interpreted the past. They often assumed that people in the past had simpler, more basic forms of family and social organization, and that these forms gradually developed into the complex societies of their own time. However, when we look more closely at the work of these historians, we can see that they weren't just blindly accepting their own biases. They were deeply engaged with the past and tried to understand it on its own terms. For example, Leopold von Ranke saw states as natural and almost divine creations, which reflected the idea of nation-states in his own time. But he also recognized that understanding the past required a deep and empathetic engagement with the people who lived in it. Similarly, Mark Bloch, a famous historian from the 20th century, argued that all of modern historiography from the work of Niebuhr to his own time was always about the historian's present. Historians ask questions that are relevant to their own time and use the past to help answer those questions. This doesn't mean that they can't understand the past accurately. It just means that their understanding is always influenced by their own context. The tension between understanding the past as it really was and explaining how it actually came to be has been a driving force in historical research for the past 2 centuries. Historians like Otto Brunner recognized that to truly understand the past, they needed to use concepts that did justice to the people and societies they were studying. This means being open to the idea that the past was different from the present, but also recognizing how the past has shaped the present. When we study kinship, we need to be aware of this tension. We should try to understand how people in the past thought about family and relationships, but we should also consider how those ideas have influenced the way we think about family today. By doing this, we can gain a deeper and more nuanced understanding of both the past and the present. In the world of history and the way people have studied it over the years, one topic that keeps coming up is kinship, or how people are related to each other. This might sound simple, but it's actually quite complex. Historians have tried to understand how people in the past saw their families, and how these relationships shaped their lives and societies. But here's the tricky part. The people we study often didn't think about kinship the way we do today. They didn't see it as a big, abstract idea that governed everything. Instead, kinship was just a part of their everyday lives, a way they understood who they were and how they fit into their world. Now, you might wonder why historians like me still talk about kinship, if it wasn't seen the same way back then. The answer is that kinship is important to us, and it has been a key part of how we understand the past. It helps us bridge the gap between our world and the world of the people we study. Even though they didn't see kinship the same way we do, it was still there, influencing their lives in ways that we can trace and understand. One of the big ideas that has shaped how I think about kinship comes from a historian named Carl Schmidt. He talked a lot about self-consciousness, which is how people saw themselves and their place in the world. For Schmidt, this was more important than just looking at the structure of families or how they functioned. He was more interested in how people's ideas about themselves and their kin influenced their actions. So, when I study kinship, I'm not just looking at how families were organized. I'm trying to understand how people thought about their relationships and what those relationships meant to them. To do this, I focus on sources where people express their thoughts and feelings about kinship. These can be letters, philosophical writings, biblical interpretations, biographies, and even records about property. In these sources, I look for words that relate to family and kinship, and I try to understand what those words meant in the context of the time and culture. It's not just about finding the words, it's about understanding what they meant to the people who use them. I also want to be clear about what I'm not doing. I'm not trying to figure out the exact reasons why certain texts were written, or to analyze every little detail of how they were produced. That's a common approach in history, but I think it can sometimes make it hard to see the bigger picture. Instead, I'm looking for general patterns and themes in how people talked about kinship. I'm trying to understand the broader cultural meanings behind these relationships. Another important part of my approach is that I focus on the aristocracy, the upper classes, because we have more sources from them, and we can more easily understand their self-expressions of kinship. I'm not ignoring other groups like peasants, but we don't have as much direct access to how they thought about kinship. I'm also not doing a lot of demographic analysis, like looking at marriage ages or family sizes, because those kinds of studies often assume that society is based on certain structures that the people in the past might not have recognized. To help me think about kinship, I've found a lot of useful ideas from anthropologists. They've been studying kinship in different cultures for a long time, and they've come up with some fascinating insights. One key idea comes from an anthropologist named David Schneider. He talked about how kinship is not just about biology or blood, but about culture and the symbols people use to understand their relationships. For example, in American culture, people often think of kinship as something natural, like blood ties. But in other cultures, kinship might be based on things like shared food or shared living spaces. Schneider's work helped shift the way anthropologists think about kinship. Instead of seeing it as a fixed biological fact, they started to see it as a cultural system, a set of symbols and meanings that people use to understand their relationships. This means that kinship is not something that exists outside of culture. It's always embedded in the culture and shaped by it. One of the big takeaways from this new way of thinking is that no society is based on kinship. In other words, kinship doesn't control everything in a society. Instead, kinship is just one part of a larger, complex system that includes religion, politics, and economic. People are born into a kinship system that gives them certain expectations and roles, but those roles are not fixed or universal. They vary from culture to culture, and even from person to person. For example, in some cultures, like in Malaysia, kinship is based on shared food, not blood. If you share food with someone, you become kin. In other cultures, like the Trobriand Islanders, the idea of a biological father is different from what we might think. They believe that a man's role in procreation is not to provide the biological material, but to shape the fetus and nourish the child with his action. These examples show that kinship is not a simple, universal concept. It's a complex, culturally specific way of understanding relationships. By studying kinship this way, we can better understand how people in the past saw themselves and their world. It helps us see the past not as a foreign land that we can never fully understand, but as a place where people like us tried to make sense of their relationships and their place in society. As we wrap up our journey through the complex world of kinship, we've seen how the lines between what is considered natural and what is considered constructed can blur in ways that challenge our most basic assumptions. Janet Karsten, a leading anthropologist, has shown us that even in the West, where kinship is often seen as fixed and biologically determined, the reality is much more fluid. Adopted children may come to see their birth parents as strangers, while organ donors and recipients can feel a deep, almost mystical connection. In London's diverse neighborhoods, teenagers claim cousinship based on shared experiences and bonds, blurring the lines between what is given and what is made. But the story doesn't end there. Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, a Brazilian anthropologist, takes us even deeper into the heart of this issue by exploring the kinship practices of Amazonian peoples. For them, kinship is not just a matter of blood or genes. Instead, it's a lived, ongoing process that involves sharing food, caring for each other, and even believing that people who live together start to resemble each other over time. This isn't just a metaphor. It's a literal belief that kinship is created through these everyday interactions. Viveiros de Castro's work highlights a crucial point. When we study kinship in non-Western societies, we must be careful not to project our own ideas of nature and culture onto them. The Amazonian view of the world is based on what he calls multinaturalism, where humans and animals share a common soul but differ in their bodies. Kinship, in this view, is about becoming human through interactions with others, including non-human beings. This is a world where yams can be your lineage brothers, and jaguars can be your cannibal brothers-in-law. These perspectives challenge the traditional Western models of kinship, which often divide relationships into consanguinity, blood relations, and affinity, marriage, and social bonds. Viveiros de Castro proposes a new model where affinity is seen as given and natural, while consanguinity is constructed and cultural. This flips our usual understanding on its head, and reminds us that what we consider natural or given is deeply rooted in our own cultural assumptions. For historians, the lessons from anthropology are not about finding a one-size-fits-all model for understanding the past. Instead, they offer a way to question our own assumptions and to see kinship as a dynamic, culturally specific phenomenon. Historians like Bernhard Jussen have noted that while medievalists may be hesitant to apply anthropological models directly to their work, the insights from anthropology can still be valuable. They can help us recognize that our modern, biologized view of kinship is not universal, and that kinship in the past was likely much more complex and varied. Marshall Solins, in his essay, What Kinship Is and Is Not, defines kinship as mutuality of being, a network of relationships where people participate in each other's existence. This definition can encompass both Western and non-Western perspectives, reminding us that kinship is about the ways people create similarity and difference, not just about blood ties. In the end, the study of kinship is a reminder that our most fundamental relationships are shaped by the societies we live in. Whether we are talking about medieval Europe, modern London, or the Amazonian rainforest, kinship is a living, breathing concept that reflects the values, beliefs, and practices of the people who create it. By understanding kinship in this way, we can gain a deeper appreciation for the rich tapestry of human connections that have woven together the fabric of our world.